What if the oldest buildings in your village held up to 500 years' worth of secrets, tunnels, restless spirits, stories of ordinary people about a community, people that talk together, perhaps sitting round a pint in a local pub? Today on Peace Unplugged, I'm again discussing the village where I live, Birchington-on-Sea, and some of the history of the oldest public house in the village, known as the Acorn Inn, sadly closed in 2015 as a drinking establishment. But the building still exists, and we'll also make reference to the other older pubs in the village. Stay with us for some more fascinating history. I'll be discussing local legendary ghosts, the Shepherd Neame brewery, stories about local heritage, the Power Alarms pub, the Sea View pub, amongst others. And stay right through to the end so that you'll understand the link to this and health and well-being. Welcome back to Peace Unplugged. This is the podcast where we slow down. We take a deep breath in and let the stories of the local community wash over, just like the tide coming in at Venice Bay. I'm so glad you're watching today. This is an episode I've been planning for some while, or one I've been really looking forward to share with you. Those of us that live in Birchington know the village pretty well, although maybe not all the lengthy history of the village. If you've not visited Birchington before, then I want you to imagine a large Kent village on the coast, a small roundabout attached to what is known as the Square, close to All Saints Church, Birchington. And that square had a number of public houses. The most interesting of which is just tucked up past the square, up a little road called Park Lane. It was a little pub called the Acorn Inn. So today I'm going to unpick a bit of its history. The Flint Cottage part of the building dates back to the 1400s. The building has a history of brewers, of publicans, of agricultural labourers, and the story of a quiet village life. But the Acorn is only part of the story. That's because Birchington, this ancient settlement, first recorded in 1240 as, that's Birchhenton. That's a name in Old English, and it means a farm where the birch tree grows. It's a village where, if you've watched my other podcasts, there's a history of smugglers, ghosts, gentry, and maybe just ordinary people whose history still lives here. That's if you know where to look. So settle into this introduction. Birchington-on-Sea, as we know, is in the Isle of Thanet, on the northeast Kent coast. It sits neatly between the towns of Herne Bay and Margate. It has chalk cliffs, wide sandy beaches, and people have come here for centuries. There's been farmers, there's been fishermen, and later Victorian holidaymakers, particularly when the railway came to Birchington. The village was first recorded in 1240, although the land was inhabited before that by the Romans. There have been artefacts found at Venice Bay. There's even been some evidence of prehistoric remains here. By the time the Normans came, Birchington was a modest farming community, and that community was organised around All Saints Church in Birchington. Parts of that church date back to the 12th century, and that church, like in many villages, stands tall and proud in the centre of the village. Again, if you've seen some of my other podcasts, the village has a history of the painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And Birchington's social world centred around All Saints Church and the public houses. Well before village halls were built, the parish affairs were apparently conducted in the upstairs rooms of the Power Alarms, at that time known as the New Inn. Likely to imagine for a moment church wardens, poor law officers, highway surveyors, meeting, looking over their accounts, setting the rates, and then presumably very likely retiring downstairs for a well-earned drink. Now let's head up those few yards up Park Lane. And here we have what was the Acorn pub in Birchington. This is the Jordan front, the back part of it, where the Flint is allegedly the oldest part of the pub, dating back a few hundred years. It's now converted into a home for the very last of the landlords of this pub. It's a place I frequented. It was my favourite pub to go in the village. Standing prominent on that narrow entrance to Park Lane is the Acorn Inn. The story of the Acorn Inn begins in 1748, but the Flint Cottage that is part of the building dates back to the late 1400s. The building would eventually become a pub and a tied cottage, and it belongs to the estate of a gentleman named Edward Cotone. He was a local landowner in Birchington. Details of early occupants of the cottage are a little bit on the sparse side, but by 1500, a gentleman named Joseph Quested, described as a woolen draper, he was living there with his wife Martha and their 5 children, a family of 7 in a tiny cottage. That cottage remained in the Cotone family throughout the 16th century. In 1611, it was occupied by a woman referred only to as Widow Lamb, a milliner, and she paid a peppercorn rent to Charles Henry Cotone. The peppercorn rent is a detail worth pausing on. It's a story of a woman who was modest but also fiercely independent. She ran her own little trade of selling cloth. Then at some point in the early 17th century, the property came into the hands of Isaac Oliphant, a brewer of Birchington. He lived there for some years, brewing beverages on the premises, and that was quite a common arrangement at the time, apparently. By 1748, that little cottage had been extended considerably, and it then gained a license to sell liquor, or at least ales, and the site became formally known as the Acorn Ale House. And there's symbolism in that name. The acorn, as we know, is a seed of oak, and that's one of England's oldest symbols of strength, resilience, and of community. So the Acorn Inn became a place of gathering for 2.5 centuries. The Acorn's license records, preserved in trade directories and census returns, well, they read like a roll call of Birchington village life. In 1858, a man named William Hayward, he's listed in Melville's directory as the then pub licensee. It later went to a man named Edward Hogbin, a publican aged 28, born in Birchington. He ran the pub with his wife Maria, also 28, along with their 2 children. This is a snapshot of mid-Victorian public life. A decade later, by 1871, George Milgate, he appears as head of the household of the Acorn, along with his wife Emma. By this time, their household included labourers and a carpenter as boarders. Pubs at that time often served as lodging houses for agricultural workers and tradesmen. There was then the Terry family, who held the Acorn through the early 1800s. Robert Terry listed as the manager of the Acorn, and his wife Anne and 3 children, Stephen, Hannah and Ada. Edward Larkins, aged 17, well, he served as the potman, the young man whose job was to collect the pots and wash them, and basically keep the bar running smoothly. This is a record of how young people built their lives around the village institutions. From the early 1890s through to the late 1930s, that's nearly 50 years, the Acorn was run by 2 successive members, the Pemble and then the Solly families. Arthur H. Pemble held the licence from 1891, then Charles Edward Solly from 1903 until 1938. That's half a century of continuity. This anchored the social life of the village. Moving back to 1838, there was a pivotal moment for the Acorn. It was purchased by Edward Neame, a farmer, a brewer, and a member of the Neame brewery family, and he lived locally in Birchington. Edward Neame ran the house from 1866, and this was the point when the breweries of Shepherd and Neame merged. The Acorn remained a Shepherd Neame tied house until the year 2000, when it then became a free house. I personally had many a pint of Shepherd Neame Master Brew, or Spitfire Ale. So year 2000, the pub had quite a considerable makeover. A new kitchen was built, along with a 40-seated restaurant area, and that pub flourished for quite some while, for a few years selling Thai food in the restaurant, and later as a more traditional, returning more back to a pub atmosphere with Sunday roasts. It was highly popular with the locals, and at the time when I frequented the pub, those times were probably the best times, until in December 2015, people owning the pub decided to take retirement and convert the pub into their home, as it is today. So part of that building still is the tiny flint cottage, currently used as the living room. That's the very bones of the structure that Joseph Quested and his family once called home. Now here comes the part of the intriguing stories around this little pub. It's what some of you might be waiting for. Old flint and timber structures hold a particular atmosphere. Now, whether you're a believer in the paranormal or not, There's something undeniable about stepping into a building that has been standing since the Tudor period. The walls have absorbed 5 centuries of human experience. That's been grief, it's been celebrations, hard winters, summer harvests, births, deaths, and everything in between. These places carry weight. So the Acorn's rear cottage structure, made of ancient flint, dating back to the 1400s, well, that's prompted a few visitors over the years to remark on that inexplicable sense of presence, a feeling in the building. And I have to tell you, I sensed it myself when I went there. It's a long history. There have been numerous accounts of people describing objects moving without explanation. Stories of the taps being turned on in the cellar. An old personal experience from me a few years ago was seeing a card hanging behind the bar with peanuts. And a packet of those peanuts, the sound of a click and then spinning right across the other side of the bar. And that was right in front of me. Somewhat unexplainable, but curious. And that, like many other reports, are pretty much unverified. And of course, old flint buildings do creak in mysterious ways as they settle. This taps into the folklore of stories of poltergeists. It conjures up the stories and the imagination of the smuggling that went on around Birchington, the tunnels, stories of bricked-up cellars, those stories I've heard from the other pubs in Birchington too. Pubs and inns were allegedly central to the trade of smuggling in a historical sense. A local tradition, still occasionally referenced, holds that the square at Birchington has long been associated with sightings of a figure in period dress, sometimes described as a woman in a bonnet, sometimes as an older man in dark clothing, who appears around the older buildings, around the square, and then vanishes before anybody can. It's now time to wander down into the village. Let's call it. It's effectively Station Road in Birchington. And here we have the Smugglers Bar and Restaurant. Here's the site of what once was the Queen's Head pub, now converted into flats. But just behind the trees in the distance there is the Power Alarms pub. And across the road there says Fields Cafe. That used to be the Pewter Pot. It was also known as the Three-Legged Toad. Coming up to the little alleyway now to the Birchington Club. Approach. Moving back to the square and across the other side of the Canterbury Road leading towards Margate is the Smugglers Restaurant. That takes its name directly from Birchington's contraband past. Linking further to the smuggling stories around Birchington, nearby at Sarr, that little village on the way to Canterbury, there is the Crown Inn, and that's one of the most storied pubs in the whole of Thanet. That also dates back around 500 years. And it's famous for its secret cherry brandy recipe, brought to Kent by the Huguenots, and it was first allegedly served there in 1774. The Crown was also the venue for the last dinner of survivors from the charge of the Light Brigade following the 1854 Battle of Balaclava. It's a pub I think I've only visited once or twice in my lifetime, but apparently there's a copy of the menu that displays the names of those from that survivors of the charge of the Light Brigade that are still on display. Again, this is another pub that embodies everything that is English in terms of a country inn. That's continuity and community, and of course honouring the past. Returning back to the Acorn, it was of course not the only pub in Birchington. Power Alarms in the square, and that's believed to be the oldest hostelry in Birchington, dating back to 1750, or possibly earlier. Research reveals that it was formerly known in pub's current name, honours Squire Powell of Queck, and apparently he served as the High Sheriff of Kent in 1823, and of course owned the nearby Queck's Park. And of course, Queck's Park is the home of the Powell Cotton Museum. The Power Alarms is a Grade 2 listed building, and it's seen centuries of Birchington life. And as I mentioned earlier, It was a meeting place for church wardens and poor law officers and highway surveyors carrying out parish business. This is essentially the origin story of English local democracy, and the Power Arms remains open today, among other pubs in the village, two of which have now closed for some years. That was the Queen's Head and the Pewter Pot. As we move down Station Road towards Birchington Station, in recent years, somewhere that I frequent now is the Wheel Ale House, probably the newest drinking establishment. Then there is the Sea View Hotel on Station Road, that apparently was originally called the Railway Hotel, and that opened in 1865. The railway, of course, transformed Birchington from a sleepy seaside village into a seaside destination. The Railway Hotel was built to serve the wave of Victorian visitors who stepped off the train in search of fresh air and that sense of relaxation by the coast. Another relatively recent pub in Birchington is Christie's Wine Bar. I remember when that opened. It's just a tiny little bar just in the wedge, and over a few years it grew into a much larger establishment, and it has the attachment of a little grass area known as Rossetti Gardens, where you will find the Gabriele Dante Rossetti Memorial. No discussion around Birchington's pub history will be complete without acknowledging the dominant force that shaped the county's drinking for more than 3 centuries. That is, of course, Shepherd Neame, based in Faversham and recognised as the oldest brewery in England, with records dating back to 1698. The Neames' family connections to Birchington run deep. Edward Neame, as mentioned earlier, who bought the Acorn in 1838 and was a member of the same Neame dynasty. Walking through any Kent village, it's almost impossible not to encounter a Shepherd Neame house. It had an enormous influence in the county, and still does. For the Acorn's regulars, through the Victorian and the Edwardian eras, the ales would have been tied to the Shepherd Neame range, Master Brew, Spitfire, and whatever seasonal ales the brewery produced. I can recall one called Bombardier. All these ales form part of the regional identity. It's like a taste of the place. So what you saw just there was the site of Birchington Club, which was apparently a drill hole back in the day. I've no idea whether this is a coincidence or it was planned, but think of the 70s comedy Dad's Army, where there was Wilmington-on-Sea and the Eastgate platoon. I often wonder whether they based that on the village here and the town of Westgate, as in Birchington-on-Sea and Westgate, as opposed to Wilmington-on-Sea and Eastgate. And, of course, the drill hall. This one's the site of the Birchington United Services Club. Or as we like to call it in Birchington, the Bottom Club. As opposed to the Birchington Club, which I just filmed, which we call the Top Club. And here we have the Seaview Hotel, which was originally called, according to research, the Railway Place, built for when the railway first came to Birchington. As far as pubs are concerned, this is a fairly recent addition. In reality, it's Christie's Wine Bar. Originally the site of a women's bicycle factory. Again, according to history, according to the research. The Golden Bridge, possibly one of the oldest Chinese takeaways in the country, owned by the same family for the 1970s. A haunt of mine. And finally, the Wheel Ale House, which is where I currently like to have my drinks. The youngest of the drinking houses in Birchington, certainly in the main part of Birchington, opened in 2013. And we're now 2026. So let's take stock of what we discovered today. The Acorn Inn in Park Lane, Birchington-on-Sea. It was not just simply a pub. It's a building with deep roots in history. The estate of Edward Catone in the household of a woolen draper, Joseph Quested. The home of a milliner called Widow Lamb, who paid a peppercorn rent to the landowner. And that was during the reign of King James I. It was the business of a brewer, Isaac Oliphant. It was the family home of Edward and Maria Hogben, who raised their children in the rooms above the bar. It was the workplace of a 17-year-old potman named Edward Larkins. It was the pride of Charles Edward Solly, who ran it for nearly 5 decades. It was a Shepherd Neame house for over a century and a half, until it became a free house in the 2000s, a restaurant, a gathering place, and finally now the home to a lovely retired couple. And throughout its life, it's been part of the village landscape. So the Acorn pub is now closed, but its story is not. So I want to close this episode with something that sits at the heart of this podcast, Peace Unplugged. The story I've revealed to you today. You may be asking, why does this really matter? Why should we care about an ancient pub on Park Lane in Birchington-on-Sea that closed in 2015? Why does it matter that the man Edward Hogbin was publican there in 1861? It matters because local history is an act of belonging. When we research the places where we live, when we learn the names of the people who walked on the same streets, drank at the same bars, something shifts in us. A sense of rootedness begins. And rootedness, as a growing body of research in psychology and community, well, it confirms well-being. It's one of the most important factors in long-term mental health. Studies in place identity, the psychological references between people and their environments. This consistently shows that people feel connected by their local history, and then they report lower levels of anxiety, greater resilience, and a stronger sense of purpose. A 2021 review published in Health and Place found that heritage engagement, including visiting historic sites, participating in local history groups, and consuming community-focused media, was associated with significant improvements in subjective well-being and a reduction in feelings of social isolation. When we listen to stories like the Acorn Inn, we're not simply consuming historical trivia. We're practicing narrative medicine. That's a therapeutic act of locating ourselves with the story that's larger than our own. The anxiety of modern life is, in part, the anxiety of disconnection, and that's from a community and from continuity, from the sense that we're a part of something that began before us, and it will continue long after us. The pub historically was where that continuity was enacted. It's where neighbours became friends. It's where parish disputes were settled. It's where labourers found lodgings. It's where young couples celebrated and old men remembered. Its closure, like the closure of so many village pubs across the United Kingdom, represents not just the loss of a building, but potentially the loss of community life. Researching and telling these stories in the modest way that I'm trying to do so is an act of resistance against forgetting. When we say the name Edward Hogbin, or Widow Lamb, or Charles Edward Solly, what we are saying is, you mattered. Your life had weight. The place where you lived and worked is worth remembering. And that is essentially healing work. That is peace. Thank you for spending so much time listening and watching this episode of Peace Unplugged. If you've got any of your personal memories of the Acorn Inn, the Power Alarms, the Smuggler's Restaurant, or any of Birchington's other pubs, any old photographs, any family stories, names that you remember from behind the bar, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. I think it would be wonderful to keep that history alive. If today's episode resonated with you, then please subscribe. If you're not from the local area of Birchington, consider researching your local area, particularly if you live in perhaps a village or small town. Discover the roots of the ground that you stand on. It's a great way of sharing, and it proves that we can all have some common history. So this episode has mainly been about pubs, and I do like to have a drink myself, but as the words in the song that I sing with my band, I like a drink or two, but please drink responsibly. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay curious, and remember, every building has a story. Every name in the census was a person. Every pub that closed was a community that changed. This is Peace Unplugged. See you next time.